Not every union is born of love, but some find their destiny in it. The dust danced lazily in the afternoon air as Margaret stepped down from the stagecoach in the small town of Cedar Valley. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the worn leather suitcase, not from the weight of her luggage, but from the uncertainty of what awaited her in that lost place in the middle of nowhere. He had traveled 3 full days from the big city, answering an ad in the newspaper that was looking for a teacher to educate the children of the region. At 25, Margaret carried the determination of someone who had lost everything and needed to start over. The sun mercilessly beat down the dusty streets of Cedar Valley, a town that looked more like a handful of stubborn houses struggling with oblivion. The wooden buildings creaked in the heat, and the dry wind carried the smell of arid earth mixed with the sweat of the horses tied in front of the hall. Margaret looked around, looking for someone who might be the representative of the local school, when her eyes found an imposing figure standing on the balcony of the hardware store. Thomas Mitchell watched the newcomer with the same attention he devoted to his flocks when he looked for signs of a storm on the horizon. There was something about this woman's posture that caught his attention, a firmness disguised as delicacy that he recognized in himself. When he heard that a teacher would come to town, he had not imagined that it would be someone so young, so different from the rude women he knew in that hostile region. Thomas's 2 children, 8-year-old Samuel and 6-year-old Emma, waited restlessly at their father's side. He had promised for months that they would soon have adequate classes, but deep down he knew that his expectations went beyond the education of the children. The loneliness of 2 years of widowhood weighed on his shoulders like a burden he carried in silence, especially on the long nights when the wind whistled between the planks of the empty house. Margaret walked towards the small group, feeling the weight of the curious looks of the locals. Her boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, and her navy blue dress already showed signs of the long journey. When she finally stopped before Thomas, she immediately noticed the intensity of her brown eyes, which seemed to measure not only her ability as an educator, but something much deeper and more personal. The initial conversation was formal, almost cold. Thomas explained the working conditions, the modest salary, the makeshift school in the basement of the church. Margaret listened intently, asking practical questions about teaching materials and student numbers. But she couldn't ignore the way he looked at her, as if he were making a decision that went far beyond hiring a teacher. Over the next few weeks, Margaret established her routine at the small school in Cedar Valley. The morning started early, with the preparation of lessons for the 15 students who attended classes irregularly, depending on the needs of the families on the farms. Samuel and Emma Mitchell were always present, always clean and punctual, unlike many other children who arrived in their dirty work clothes in the fields. Thomas showed up at school more often than necessary. He brought supplies that had not been ordered, repaired things that were not broken, stayed longer than any parent should have to watch their children's classes. Margaret could see these signs, but she pretended not to notice the growing interest of this silent man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his broad shoulders. Thomas's farm was only 2 miles from town, but to his children, that distance represented a world of differences. At home, they took care of household chores with the precocious competence of someone who had lost their mother at a very early age. At school, they could finally just be kids, learning about numbers and letters, listening to stories that Margaret told with a passion that lit up her green eyes. It was during a particularly hot October afternoon that Thomas made the decision that would change the lives of all of them. Margaret was organizing the textbooks when he showed up at the door of the school without his children for the first time. His expression was serious, determined, like that of a man who had spent whole nights thinking about something important and had finally come to a conclusion. The words Thomas said that afternoon echoed in Margaret's mind for days. It was not a declaration of passionate love, nor a romantic proposal of marriage. It was a practical, straightforward proposition, born out of the needs of both of them and the circumstances that life had imposed on them. "My children need a mother," he said, "and you need security. "We can build something good together." Margaret did not immediately respond. He asked for time to think, and Thomas respected his silence. She spent the next few days watching Samuel and Emma with different eyes, noticing how they looked at her with barely concealed hope, as if she could fill the void left by her mother's absence. She also observed Thomas in a new way, seeing beyond the rough and straightforward man he appeared to be, discovering the subtle kindnesses and quiet care he showed to his children and to herself. The answer came on a cold November morning, when Margaret woke up alone in her small rented room above the fabric store and felt the weight of loneliness like never before. She had lost her family in a fire 2 years earlier. She had wandered from town to town, trying to start over, and maybe it was time to accept that fresh starts sometimes come in ways we don't expect. When Thomas arrived to pick up the children that day, Margaret was waiting for him with a decision made. Her eyes met across the empty classroom, and he knew the answer before she even spoke. There was a quiet wisdom in that moment, a mutual understanding that sometimes true love is born out of shared need and grows with time and care. The wedding took place on a cold December morning, when the biting wind swept across the plains and the distant mountains were lost in a greyish haze. The ceremony was simple, held in the small wooden church of Cedar Valley, with only the pastor, 2 witnesses, and Samuel and Emma as the only guests. Margaret wore her best dress, the same navy blue as on arrival, now carefully washed and ironed. Thomas wore his only suit, kept since the funeral of his first wife, with the smell of mothballs still impregnated in the fabric. There were no passionate declarations or romantic promises. The words were uttered with the sobriety of one who was sealing a practical agreement, but Margaret noticed that Thomas's voice trembled slightly when he said yes, and his own fingers trembled as he placed the simple gold ring in his hand. Samuel held Emma's hand throughout the ceremony, both with expressions too serious for such small children, as if they understood the importance of that moment for their lives. The move to the Mitchell farm happened on the same day as the wedding. Margaret carried only 2 suitcases with her few personal belongings and a box of books that she considered her most precious treasures. The house was larger than he expected, built of solid wood with a wide porch that overlooked the wheat fields and the corral where the cattle sheltered from the wind. Inside, the house showed clear signs of the absence of a woman 2 years ago. Faded curtains, dust-covered furniture, a functional kitchen, but without the feminine touches that make a house feel like home. Thomas showed Margaret the room that would be hers, at the end of the hall, away from his own room. She took the gesture as a show of respect, but she also felt a strange twinge of disappointment that she chose not to analyze too deeply. He had been clear from the beginning about the conditions of that marriage. She would have her privacy, he would have his, and together they would take care of the children and the property. The first days on the farm were a constant discovery. Margaret would wake up before dawn, accustomed to the strict routine of school, and find Thomas already up, brewing strong coffee in the kitchen. They talked little during these silent mornings, but there was a careful courtesy between them, an attempt to set respectful boundaries in a situation neither of them had planned for their lives. Samuel and Emma reacted to Margaret's presence in the house with a mixture of hope and caution. They watched her constantly, as if they feared that she might disappear at any moment, as had happened to her mother. Margaret could see these looks and tried to win the children's trust with small gestures. She prepared Samuel's favorite breakfast, combed Emma's hair with extra care, told bedtime stories in a soft voice that filled the silence of the house. The farm routine was more demanding than Margaret had anticipated. In addition to continuing to teach at the Cedar Valley School 3 times a week, she now had the responsibilities of taking care of the house, preparing meals for the family, and helping with the smaller chores of the estate. Thomas never demanded anything from her, but Margaret felt an internal pressure to prove that she was fulfilling her end of the bargain they had made. The nights were the most difficult moments. After the children were asleep and Thomas retired to review the farm's account books, Margaret would be alone in the living room, sewing or reading by lamplight. The silence of the house was different from the silence of the rented room in the city. Here, she could hear the sighs and movements of other people, constant reminders that she was now part of a family, even if in a still undefined way. It was during one of these lonely nights, about 3 weeks after the wedding, that Margaret heard footsteps in the hallway. She expected it to be one of the children with nightmares, but it was Thomas who appeared at the entrance of the room, hesitant and clearly uncomfortable. He held 2 cups of hot tea and offered her one without saying anything. They sat quietly for long minutes, sipping tea and watching the flames dance on the fireplace. Thomas was the first to speak, his voice low and careful. He thanked Margaret for her patience with the children, for the way she was adjusting to life on the farm, for the kindness she showed even in such an unconventional situation. Margaret responded with the same caution, acknowledging that he was also being respectful and careful, giving her time to adjust. This nightly conversation became a silent habit between them. Not every night, but often enough that they both started to look forward to those moments of quiet company. They talked about the farm, about the children, about the plans for the next planting season. They rarely touched on personal matters, but there was a growing intimacy in these shared silences. The winter was harsh that year, with blizzards that isolated the farm for days at a time. During these storms, the family was confined to the house, and Margaret discovered aspects of Thomas that she had not noticed before. He was patient with children. When they became restless, he could tell stories about the first settlers in the area. He had surprisingly delicate hands when he helped Emma do small crafts. Margaret also revealed parts of herself during those closed days. She played the piano, an old, out-of-tune instrument that had been sitting in the room since the death of Thomas's first wife. His songs filled the house with a beautiful melancholy that made Samuel and Emma approach shyly, and even Thomas stopped what he was doing to listen. One January morning, when the snow covered everything as far as the eye could see, Emma fell ill with a high fever. Margaret spent the whole night taking care of the girl, applying cold compresses, giving her home remedies, singing softly to calm her down. Thomas remained awake too, preparing teas, helping to change compresses, sharing with Margaret the silent concern of those who fear losing someone dear to them. It was during that difficult night that something changed between them. When Emma's fever finally subsided at dawn, Thomas and Margaret looked through the room lit by the golden light of the rising sun, and there was a mutual recognition that they were no longer just 2 people sharing practical responsibilities. They had become real partners, united by genuine concern for these children and the discreet care they had been developing for each other. Spring arrived earlier that year, melting the snow and bringing the smell of damp earth and new shoots. Margaret planted a small garden behind the house, teaching Samuel and Emma about seeds and growth, about patience and care. Thomas watched from afar, smiling discreetly as he saw how his home was becoming a real home, how his children were flourishing under the care of this woman who had arrived as a teacher and was becoming much more than that. The summer brought challenges that none of them had anticipated. The prolonged drought threatened to destroy the wheat crop, and Thomas spent entire days in the fields, trying to save what he could with the little water that was left in the well. Margaret watched him from the kitchen window, seeing how he carried the weight of worry on his hunched shoulders, how his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. The nights of quiet conversation gave way to tense discussions about money, about the possibility of losing the farm, about the future of the children if things continued like this. Margaret offered to use her small savings to help, but Thomas refused with a firmness bordering on harshness. She understood that it wasn't just male pride, but the deep fear of a man who had already lost a wife and feared losing everything else he had left. It was during one of these difficult discussions that Thomas finally told Margaret about Sarah, his first wife. She had been his youthful crush, a vivacious and dreamy woman who died in childbirth of her 3rd child, taking the baby with her. Thomas carried the silent guilt of having allowed her to become pregnant again, knowing the risks, and this guilt had become an invisible barrier that he built between himself and any possibility of true love. Margaret listened in silence, finally understanding why Thomas kept such a careful distance, why he treated their marriage as a business arrangement rather than a union of two people who were clearly beginning to care for each other. She didn't try to console him with empty words, but simply stood by his side on the porch, stargazing and sharing the weight of her pain. The financial problems intensified when the Cedar Valley Bank threatened to foreclose on the farm. Thomas had borrowed money the previous year to buy additional cattle, betting on a good harvest that now seemed impossible. Margaret suggested that she return to teaching full-time, but the school barely had the resources to pay her reduced salary, and the money would not be enough to save the property. It was Samuel who brought the solution, unaware that he was doing so. The boy casually mentioned over dinner that he had seen strange men surveying the farm's northern lands, taking notes and measuring distances. Thomas frowned, puzzled, and the next day rode there to investigate. What he discovered changed everything. The railroad was planning a line that would pass through exactly those lands, and the company was willing to pay well for the rights of way. The negotiation with the railway company was complex and time-consuming. Thomas didn't trust big city lawyers, but he also knew he couldn't handle such complicated contracts on his own. Margaret surprised everyone, including herself, by revealing that she understood legal documents. Her father had been an accountant before he died, and she had learned to read contracts and understand legal terms by helping him in the office during her youth. Together, Thomas and Margaret spent weeks studying each clause of the contract, discussing each term, planning how to use the severance money as smartly as possible. These nights of working together brought them closer together in a way that casual conversations had never been able to. They found that they thought similarly about money and planning, that they shared values about hard work and family responsibility. The final agreement with the railroad secured not only the payment of the farm's debts, but also enough resources to modernize the property and invest in improvements that Thomas had dreamed of for years. Most importantly, the contract included a clause that gave the Mitchell family a small percentage of the profits from transporting goods across the line, ensuring a steady income for the next 20 years. The celebration was modest. Only the family gathered around the kitchen table, but there was a genuine joy that had not been seen in that house for a long time. Samuel and Emma laughed out loud as Thomas lifted them up in the air, one at a time, and Margaret felt her heart warm as she saw the serious, worried man become the affectionate father her children deserved. That night, after the children went to sleep, Thomas called Margaret for a walk in the fields. They walked in silence for a while, watching the full moon illuminate the wheat plants they had managed to save from drought. When they finally stopped near the stream that cut through the property, Thomas turned to Margaret with an expression she had never seen before. He talked about how she had saved not only the farm, but the entire family, how his intelligence and determination had transformed a desperate situation into an opportunity for growth. How he had started the marriage thinking he was offering her security, but he had discovered that it was Margaret who was offering security to all of them. Margaret replied that she had found something on that farm that she did not even know she was looking for, a place where she could use all her talents, where she was valued not only as a teacher or caregiver, but as a true partner. She told about how she'd learned to love not only the children, but the land itself, the routine of the farm, the feeling of building something durable and meaningful. It was Thomas who took the first step. He reached out to touch Margaret's face, silently asking if he could come closer. She replied by covering his hand with hers, and when he kissed her softly in the moonlight, it was as if they were both sealing a new deal, very different from the first. They walked back home holding hands, knowing that something fundamental had changed between them. The marriage of convenience was slowly transforming into a union based on mutual respect, companionship, and perhaps something deeper that neither was yet ready to name. The following months brought visible changes in the family dynamics. Thomas began consulting with Margaret on all the important decisions of the farm, valuing her opinion and her different perspective. Margaret took on more responsibility in managing the estate, discovering that she had a natural talent for organizing resources and planning investments. Samuel and Emma flourished in this more harmonious environment. The boy began to help his father with more enthusiasm, proud to be part of a family that was growing and thriving. Emma grew more and more attached to Margaret, naturally calling her mother without anyone suggesting it. The house has also been transformed. Margaret renovated the rooms one by one, bringing color and life to spaces that had remained gloomy for years. She sewed new curtains, organized the furniture, created small, cozy corners where the family could gather. Thomas watched these changes with quiet gratitude, watching his home become a home again. Fall came with the promise of a better harvest, and with it came the certainty that the Mitchell family had not only survived the hardships, but had grown stronger through them. Thomas and Margaret worked side by side in the fields, planned the future of the farm together, cared for the children together with a harmony that seemed natural, as if they had always been a real family. The first wedding anniversary arrived without either of them mentioning the date. Margaret woke up early as usual, but found the kitchen empty and a note from Thomas saying that he had gone to check on the new calves in the north pasture. She smiled as she read the message, recognizing in that simple gesture the practical man she had learned to love, someone who showed affection through everyday actions rather than grand romantic gestures. Samuel and Emma ran to the kitchen as they always did on cold mornings, but this time they brought wildflowers they had picked on the way to school the day before. Emma handed the little bouquet to Margaret with a shy smile, saying that the flowers were to thank her for making the house so beautiful. Samuel, more reserved, simply hugged Margaret tightly and whispered that he was glad she stayed with them. When Thomas returned from the pasture, he found the family gathered in the kitchen, laughing at something Emma had told him about her friends at school. He paused in the doorway for a moment, watching the scene with an expression of deep contentment. Margaret noticed their presence, and their gazes met over the children's heads, sharing a quiet understanding of how their lives had changed that year. During dinner, Thomas mentioned that he had received a letter from the railroad company confirming that construction of the line would begin the following spring. That would mean more movement in the area, new business opportunities, maybe even a bigger school for Cedar Valley. Margaret listened to the plans with interest, offering suggestions and ideas, and participated naturally in family decisions, as she always did now. After the children went to sleep, Thomas and Margaret went out to the balcony as they had done so many times during that year. The air was crisp and clean, loaded with the smell of dry leaves and the promise of snow. Thomas held 2 cups of hot coffee, and they sat side by side in the rocking chair he had repaired in the summer. It was Margaret who broke the silence this time, talking about how her life had taken a direction she could never have imagined when she stepped down from the stagecoach in Cedar Valley. She told how she had arrived looking only for a job and security, but had found a real family and a purpose that filled each day with meaning. Thomas replied with carefully chosen words, admitting that he had also discovered things about himself during that year. He had learned that it was possible to honor Sarah's memory while building something new and valuable with Margaret. That love could come in different forms, ripening slowly like a good harvest, creating deep and lasting roots. They were silent for a while, gently rocking and stargazing. Margaret rested her head on Thomas's shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her naturally. There were no dramatic declarations or grandiose promises, just the quiet certainty that they had built something solid and true together. Inside the house, Samuel woke up thirsty and went to the kitchen to fetch water. Through the window, she saw her adoptive parents sitting together on the porch and smiled before returning to bed. Emma, who had woken up too, asked him what he was doing, and Samuel simply said he was checking to see if everything was okay. And it was. Finally, after so long, all was well in that family. Winter came milder that year, and the Mitchell family faced it with renewed confidence. The farm was thriving, the children were growing up healthy and happy, and Thomas and Margaret had found a perfect balance between companionship and true love. On Christmas Eve, when the snow was softly covering the fields, and the house was decorated with pine branches and lighted candles, Margaret realized something that made her smile. She had failed to count the months since her arrival in Cedar Valley. Time was no longer something she marked in terms of before and after, but simply something that flowed naturally through days filled with purpose and joy. Thomas had also changed, becoming lighter, more prone to laughter, more open with his affection for the children and for Margaret. The guilt he had carried for so long had turned into gratitude for the second chance that life had offered him. And so, on a cold December night, as the children slept and the wind blew gently across the fields, Thomas and Margaret Mitchell prepared to face together all the challenges and joys that the future might bring, knowing that they had found in each other not just security or convenience, but a true love that had grown slowly and taken root deep in the barren land of their lonely hearts. If you've made it this far, it's because the stories of the Wild West awaken something special in you. Just as Margaret found her place in Cedar Valley, you found a channel that understands her passion for authentic and exciting storytelling. This is just the beginning of many journeys that we will share together. We have stories of lone cowboys, brave sheriffs, pioneer women, and families who built their dreams in the vastness of the American West. If you want to continue exploring these lands of adventure and excitement, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. That way, you don't miss any new stories we publish.